Aid agencies are warning of a spiralling humanitarian crisis in the Democratic Republic of Congo in Central Africa. Fighters from the M23 rebel group claim to have taken control of the eastern city of Goma. The Congolese government does dispute this. Thousands of civilians are fleeing across the border into Rwanda, and the United Nations says hospitals in Goma are overwhelmed.
Armed M23 soldiers patrol the streets of Goma. Their violent advance is causing chaos in the city and has displaced hundreds of thousands of people in the area.
Our colleagues in the Democratic Republic of the Congo report heavy small arms fire and mortar fire across the city and the presence of many dead bodies in the streets.
Bombs are falling on hospitals and the population is terrorised. That's clearly their aim, to sow terror. Yesterday, bombs were falling on camps for displaced people as well.
M23 is one of about 100 armed groups vying for control in the mineral-rich eastern region of the Democratic Republic of Congo. The UN accuses neighbouring Rwanda of backing the fighters to allow it access to valuable resources. M23's roots trace back to the aftermath of the 1994 Rwandan genocide. More than 800,000 people, mostly Tutsis, were killed. Around 1 million Rwandan Hutus, many said to be involved in the massacres, fled to the DRC's east. Rwanda has accused the Congolese army of protecting them. The M23 rebel group is mainly made up of Tutsis. They led a failed attempt to overthrow the Congolese government in 2012, temporarily claiming the city of Goma. Peace talks back then left the group dormant for around a decade. Their resurgence now has prompted calls from around the region for renewed negotiations.
It was, it is, and I'm sure it will continue to be the case, that engagement, dialogue, consultations is the only viable way out of the situation in DRC.
UN staff have left Goma as the violence escalates, limiting access to essential services. But for many Congolese, fleeing is neither safe nor affordable. With many left behind, hopeful the fighting can be resolved quickly and a wider war avoided.
We can get more now about the situation in Goma from Mudge, who's Central Africa Director at Human Rights Watch. Welcome to DW, Lewis. Could you start by telling us more about the situation for civilians in particular caught in the crossfire in Goma?
Yeah, thank you for having me. The situation for civilians as it stands right now is we're looking at an unfolding humanitarian catastrophe. We've got situations whereby, as your previous piece just alluded to, food is becoming more and more scarce. Since Sunday, there's been no electricity and no running water in the city of Goma. This is the third biggest city in the Congo, a city of between 1 and 2 million people, and that's not including the hundreds of thousands of displaced. Cell phone networks have been cut. It's very hard for us right now to be in communication from our East African teams with folks on the ground. We've had to evacuate some of our staff. And in terms of the actual humanitarian conditions, that has only been made worse with regards to the fact that now M23 and government forces with their own allies, that fighting is making it very, very hard for these humanitarian actors, those who remain, to get to camps of the displaced people who might need assistance, to keep hospitals functioning, and to get them food and life-saving support. So it's a dire situation that unfortunately is getting worse by the day here.
What is your biggest concern at the moment regarding the M23 and, as is being suggested, the Rwandan forces fighting in Goma? What's the most concerning part of this?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen an iteration of this before. We saw this 12 years ago when the M23 took Goma. And we certainly, alongside the United Nations, we are certainly saying that the Rwandan troops are fighting alongside M23. For us at Human Rights Watch, we've documented that, and that is certainly happening. I think the biggest concern is civilian protection. M23 have now taken the city. They effectively control the city. There are pockets of fighting still unfolding right now, but they effectively control Goma. And what we are urging M23 and the Rwandan forces not to do is to engage in reprisal killings. We want them to respect principles of international humanitarian law, vis-a-vis allowing people to flee, allowing people to get medical assistance and get to the hospital or get food assistance if they need it. We also want to urge both sides, as this fighting continues, to really refrain from attacking civilian infrastructure. On the Congolese side, we're seeing some pockets, some holdouts of FARDC, that's the National Army, alongside their allies called the Wazalendu. We're getting reports that these people have switched to civilian clothing in some instances, and we're really getting an indication that they are also engaged in looting and attacking of civilians. So we're really, the first and foremost, our call is to urge both sides, but in particular M23 and the Rwandans, who now are seemingly in control of most of the city, to refrain from attacking civilians.
And what would you like to see from countries outside of the DRC and Rwanda to try to help bring this long-running conflict to an end?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the issues that 12 years ago, the conflict was addressed, but that was only the immediate conflict and the root causes weren't addressed. So number one, what needs to happen is there needs to be pressure put on both Rwanda and the Congo to cease attacks on civilians, and on Rwanda and the M23 to really pull back from this major urban area that they now control. The EU, frankly, has been abysmal in this. On the one hand, you've got the EU, condemning Rwanda for its support of the M23, and then on the other hand, you've got the EU literally financing the Rwandan Defense Forces to send troops to Mozambique to protect gas interests in Mozambique. So there has to be a much more coherent strategy vis-a-vis how Rwanda gets its training and funding for its army, much of which comes from these Western powers. And number two, yes, there's a political process. That piece you just showed referred to a political process. Yes, it's important for actors to engage in the process. But once again, when we see these actors time and time again commit these types of crimes, take over cities such as Goma, and there's no accountability, we're literally just setting the scenario for this to happen again. So it's high time that there's actually accountability measures put in place to hold the leaders of these groups responsible for the war crimes that are unfolding now as we speak.
Lewis Mudge, head of Central Africa for Human Rights Watch. Lewis, thank you so much for your insights. Really good to talk to you.
I'm joined now by Richard Moncrieff, a project director with the International Crisis Group Consultancy. He joins us from Lee. Richard, what are you hearing about the situation on the ground in Goma right now?
Well, actually, what I've been hearing this morning is that the fight is more or less over. And I think the strong chances are that Goma has been taken over by M23. The last we heard, there was some fighting around the airport, where some of the international troops and the very last remaining fighters of the Congolese army in Goma were holding out. But even that, I've heard, may be now over. And I think in the hours and days to come, we will now simply say that the M23 has taken over Goma, noting that many of the troops in the National Army and many of their informal militia auxiliary retreated back into the city over the weekend and have kind of melted into the population or have been arrested by the M23. So I think it's pretty much fight over, or at least we will be saying that in the hours and days to come.
Give us a sense of the rebels' motivation. What exactly are they trying to achieve with their apparent capture of Goma?
Well, I think primarily put pressure on President Tshisekedi of the DR Congo. The rebels have been fighting for territory in North Kivu province, as you mentioned before, for over 3 years, taking some very rich mining areas. But the latest round of fighting was sparked off at the end of last year, when there was a failed summit, and that was between the Rwandan and the Congolese presidents. They were meant to meet, but they never did. And that sparked off some rather heated rhetoric on both sides. And my feeling is that Rwanda, who backed the M23, wanted to, as it were, teach President Tshisekedi a lesson and flex their muscles and show who was really in charge, to then come back to the negotiating table in a much, much stronger position and impose its own terms. Now, just to come to your question about what the M23 want, well, I mean, they're happy to have taken over most of North Kivu province. They've been pushing into South Kivu. They have some demands that concern the future of their leaders, that concern the Congolese Tutsis and so forth. But I think that they're really an insurgency group that's seeking to take territory and destabilize the government in Kinshasa.
You mentioned Rwanda's backing of the M23 rebel. What exactly is their role and their goal in all of this?
Well, firstly, Rwanda's role, we should point out that Rwanda have been backing these rebels since the beginning, so for 3 years or so. This came at a time when Rwanda was feeling somewhat under pressure in North Kivu, which it sees as its area of influence, its backyard, if you like. And it felt it was losing influence and losing power. So that's where the decision to back this insurgent group came from. So they've been backing them for a long time. But in the last, let's say the last year or so, according to evidence gathered by UN investigators and also evidence that I've gathered myself, Rwandan backing has increased a lot. Thousands of Rwandan troops have crossed over the border into North Kivu, into DR Congo, to back up these insurgents. And remember that before the fall of Goma yesterday, rebels had taken some key strategic towns, both in North Kivu and in neighboring South Kivu. As I mentioned, some big mining areas, and they couldn't have done that without really strong Rwandan backing in terms of ammunition, artillery, surface-to-air missile support, recruitment support, and financing. In terms of what they are after, again, I think Rwanda is there to put maximum pressure on Felix Tshisekedi, the president of Congo, and also, I think, to confirm its domination of North Kivu province, which it really feels is its backyard. And having one of the most effective armies in the region, it feels that it has the strength to take control of that province.
That was Richard Moncrieff with the International Crisis Group. Thank you so much for all those insights.
The unrest in eastern DRC has now swept over to the capital, Kinshasa, which is about 1,600 kilometres away from Goma. Angry crowds have attacked the Rwandan embassy in the city, as well as other embassies they see as favouring Rwanda. Protesters set fire to parts of the French and Belgian embassies and also targeted those of the US, Kenya and the Netherlands. Several incidents of looting have also been reported. Let's cross live now to Kinshasa to speak to our correspondent, Jonas Gerding. Jonas, I believe you filmed some of the violence in the capital today. Can you tell us more about what you witnessed?
Yeah, so on my way to the office, I actually came by the Rwandan embassy, and to my surprise, there was like a huge crowd. People were gathering, and first of all, I didn't understand exactly what was going on, but then I saw that they started to put the embassy on fire. Myself, I immediately drove away, and I got away, but then I took refuge at the colleague's office, and from the balcony I could see the crowd which was passing by, and they were starting to burn tires, they were starting to riot, and the police, they came in, they started to disperse the crowds, they shot, and then the crowds, they moved on, they started to loot supermarkets, and at the end of the day the city looked like very, very devastated, and some of those areas, it looked really like a battlefield.
As you say, protesters are targeting embassies, including the French and Belgian embassies. Can you help us understand why those embassies in particular were attacked?
Yeah, the French question is somehow related to its history. It's been related to to Rwanda, where there has been the genocide in 1994, and this was something which wasn't prevented by the former colony Rwanda. So you could some argue that there's some kind of guilt, and that for this they were always supporting Rwanda, which had a kind of impressive development. And this is something which on the Congolese side they have seen all those violence, all those human rights violations, national law violations, and that's it. For the Belgium is the former colony of the DRC, so we've got this. But in general, I would rather say that they are rather like a symbol for the mistrust of the Congolese population towards Europe, which is considered as an ally of Rwanda, that's the narrative, which is exploiting the natural resources in the DRC by using Rwanda as a proxy, which is destabilizing the region.
The UN peacekeeping chief, Jean-Pierre Lacroix, said yesterday that there is, quote, no question that there are Rwandan troops in Goma. Yet we know that M23 rebels deny that they are supported by Rwanda. Can you talk to us about the evidence that shows that there is Rwandan involvement here?
Yeah, there's absolutely no question that they are involved. The rebellion started in 2021, and first of all, we didn't see that much evidence, but then drone footage showed like first soldiers, first military equipment on the DRC side, and like every other UN report documented even more troops. So finally, we're talking around 3,000 to 4,000 troops which are on the ground documented, but the DRC is accusing the government that before the attack on Goma, they were sending even more soldiers on the ground, so the evidence is really strong.
We'll have to leave it there. DW correspondent Jonas Gerding reporting from Kinshasa. Jonas, thank you so much.